What is up, guys? In today's video, we are trying to get Josh's Mustang started. Josh, what is the engine in this?
It's a 302 trick flow top end kit. That's about it.
Cool. So this car hasn't ran for probably like, what, 6 months now?
Yeah, it's been 6-8 months.
Okay, cool. So he's got the Holley Terminator X kit here. So we got like the main wiring harness. We got a sub harness that pretty much provides power to the main harness. And then we got some other stuff over here. So there are a few flying lead wires that we have to splice in, so we are going to go over those. Right now, we are focusing on pulling some wires out that we need from the main harness, mainly being the coil. And we also have one more wire for the coolant temp sensor. That one's actually over here in the injector harness. So this is going to go to the factory coolant temp sensor. And that's just so that the factory gauges work. Josh has an aftermarket oil pressure gauge, so we're not going to be hooking that one up. We already have the Holley Terminator X mounted. Josh bolted it down. Unfortunately, for some reason, his didn't come with any mounting hardware, so we just had to pull some screws and bolts to temporarily mount it until we get some better hardware. But anyway, yeah, we're going to have to slit the floor right here to run the main harness through. But right now, Josh is installing the injectors and the fuel rail, and I'm going to start trying to pull apart the factory coil wire and that engine coolant temp wire so we can run the factory gauges. So we'll check back with you guys in a few minutes. Quick update, I'm still untangling stuff here. It's a complete mess. Josh is going to start running the harness. So he's just going to run the harness down and plug it into the Terminator X. Can you fish that other stuff through there? There we go. Okay, so we just got everything pushed through, and Josh actually took off the relay. Where was that relay?
Right here.
Yeah, so Josh took that off so we could actually fit everything through, and it fit through fine. So now, since the Holley mount's right there under the seat, I think Josh is just going to run it under the carpet here and then cut a slit to connect it to the ECU, and we should be good under here. Obviously, we have our flying leads to hook up, but that's pretty much... Oh, and the map wire, right?
Yep.
Nice. Okay, so quick update here. Like I said before, we needed the factory coil to run our factory tack, and we needed the factory engine coolant temp wire to run our factory engine coolant temp sensor. If you want to run your factory oil pressure sensor, then you also have to untangle that. So I'll show you how I untangled the factory engine coolant temp sensor. So here it is right here, and I basically ran this wire back. It goes through this large white salt and pepper connector is what they call it, I think. So this large white connector, and then it runs down through here. There it is right here. And it runs all the way back to right here. So this connects to the body harness back here, and then it'll run straight to our coolant temp gauge in the cluster. So we'll have that. Same for the coil. The two coil wires were spliced in, so I have them laying right here. And that will run back to this gray connector. So that'll power the tack in the dash. So I'll pull those wires completely out, cut all the rest of them off, and then we'll have a nice little harness that we can use to run our factory gauges. Okay, so I've cut the two gray and black connectors out of the engine harness with lots of extra wires to spare. I wanted to keep all the extra wires intact in case I find out that we need them in the future. And these will allow us to make our custom harnesses to run the gauges in the dash. The gray connector will be used to run the tachometer through the coil, and the black connector will be used to run our coolant temp sensor. Now, we're not hooking up the OEM oil pressure sensor in the cluster. If you need that, you'll also have to run that wire. So let's get right into it. For the coolant temp sensor, it's going to be really easy because we just have to splice those wires together. Obviously, we don't want to keep that giant white connector, so we essentially just cut the wire on either side of that and we're just going to splice it together. On the gray connector, we're going to be following this wiring diagram, which came with the Terminator X, in order to build a custom harness for our stock coil. If you're not using the stock coil, you'll need to follow the other wiring diagram or find a wiring diagram online to use for your specific application. So while Josh is running the second harness back to the Terminator X, and that is the harness that actually powers the ECU, it just runs from the battery to the ECU to provide it power, I'm going to be working on the harness to run the stock tachometer and also power the factory coil, because we are using a factory coil in this car. The first thing I have to do is solder this coil connector onto the harness because the previous crimps were absolutely terrible. It seems like at some point someone replaced the connector in Josh's original engine harness for whatever reason, so we're just going to do a little bit better job here and make sure these connections are properly sealed. Yeah, so in the last clip I was showing wiring up this coil harness. So we basically have a little harness just for the coil that runs back to the gray connector, and then for this black connector we have just like one wire coming off for the coolant temp sensor. And then Josh was working on getting his alternator hooked up because you didn't have your headlight harness hooked up before, right?
It's all ripped out.
Yep, so he's got that done. We got a few of the connectors on. Josh got this hooked up in here. We still have to splice in flying lead wires, so we're gonna get to that. But right now I'm gonna work on doing the TPS connector because we have to splice in a different connector onto the factory TPS. And Josh is probably gonna swap out these injectors because this plug doesn't connect to the harness because it's not a factory Ford, or it's not the factory like 5.0 liter plug, right?
Yeah, or 24 pound Ford.
Oh, okay. These are like the Ford racing ones, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so we're just gonna put some old injectors we had laying around that'll adapt. There was an adapter for this, but for some reason it doesn't plug into the Holley harness. So luckily we have a bag of old injectors over here. At least we can start the car with these. What were these, 19 pound?
Yeah, 19 pounds.
Okay, well at least it'll start with it. So like I was saying, this is the stock TPS, and a Holley has this connector that I need to splice on here. So we need to crimp these three, put these insulators on there, and then it'll connect to the Holley harness to give the ECU the TPS signal. So distributor is hooked up. Josh put distributor in, connected to the harness we had, and everything else is pretty much hooked up. So Josh is checking spark plugs. We got some grounds to do over there. Josh put a ground back there that runs to the transmission. What else do we have? I'm gonna work on those power wires over here for the Terminator. This is the power and the ground for the Terminator X, and then this is I think this powers like the Terminator X, I think this is for that fuel relay for the Terminator X, but either way, all of them need eyelets on there, and they need to be mounted in either to these two to the positive, these to the negative. Oh, and then I guess you can put the intake on, right, Josh? We're ready for that. Fuel lines and some other non-Terminator X related stuff to get this thing started.
Yep.
We do here is go back.
So I did get the power and the ground connected here, and the power wire connected here, and now I'm inside the car. I just got this eyelet crimped onto this ground. So we'll screw back here, and I'm going to use for the ground. Okay, so we fished this green wire for the fuel pump all the way through. We kind of ran it under the carpet from over there, and then we pulled the pink and black wire and spliced it in. So this is for the 12-volt switch, and we should be able to tie in maybe right here or right here. We might have to test that one. Like when we turn the key on, if it gets 12 volts, then we'll know it's switched. So we'll probably do that when we hook the battery up, just to be sure that we have a 12 volt switched, but that's not really that hard, because we'll just pop the fuse out and then just pop it right in. The proper way to do it is to get one of these, but for today, we'll probably just, you know, push it in there along with the fuse, and it should be fine. Okay, so we tested this right here. This is for the radio. There's already a source plugged onto it, but we're just gonna put another one on here. Just make sure it doesn't jump the fuse. So as you guys saw, we did the setup. Josh did the setup on the Terminator X. The car did like a little click. We had fuel pressure, but unfortunately it didn't start. So Josh is gonna have to look into his starter, but we think we have everything wired up properly, because the Terminator X was able to read at least the TPS sensor, and it was able to go through the initial setup and flash the tune. So we're hopeful that next time we'll be able to figure out the starter issue and the car will start.